Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That's what Carl Jung said. But what if that fate was never really yours to begin with? What if the way you shrink when things get too loud? What if the way you chase peace is by avoiding yourself? Isn't who you are, but who you had to become? What if the behaviors you've called just my personality, the wounds you've called normal, the fears you've dressed up as being careful, are really just fragments of a shadow, a part of you you've never dared to meet? Shadow work. It's not a trend. It's not a method to feel better. It's something deeper, something older, a kind of spiritual surgery your soul has been whispering for, in those quiet moments when everything else goes still. And this journey, it isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about looking at what you've abandoned and finally saying, I'm ready to come back. So let's not rush to escape the dark. Let's walk into it with open eyes. And this time, let's not flinch. How the shadow affects our lives. They told you not to cry. They told you to be nice. They told you to calm down, be quiet, stop making a scene. So you listened, not because it felt right, but because somewhere deep inside, you learned that love has conditions. And so, little by little, you buried pieces of yourself, your rage, your grief, your wild joy, the fire in you that said no when they wanted yes. You didn't throw them away. You couldn't. You just pushed them out of sight. But nothing truly disappears, and what we bury starts to shape us, silently, invisibly, from the inside out. That's the shadow, not evil, not broken, just the part of you that never got the chance to breathe. We think we're responding to life, to the people who trigger us, to the disappointments we keep running into, to the same fight we've had 1,000 different ways. But often, we're not responding to life. We're reacting to the shadow. That coworker who angers you may just remind you of your own silence. That friend you can't forgive may reflect the part of you still screaming for justice. That failure you keep reliving might not be about the world. It might be about the belief that says, I don't deserve more. Because that's what the shadow does. It distorts our sight until we think the enemy is out there when it's really a forgotten part of ourselves calling to be seen. It can show up in the way we shrink around success, the way we chase validation that never fills us, or the way we sabotage peace because chaos feels familiar. We don't do this because we're broken. We do it because it's all we know, because safety, once upon a time, meant hiding. But Jung knew that what we hide becomes what drives us, that until we face what we've buried, we'll keep reenacting the same story just with different names, different faces, different endings. And there's a quiet kind of tragedy in that. But here's the thing, shadow work doesn't ask you to fix yourself. It asks you to remember, to return, to sit with the parts of you that were once too much, too loud, too raw, and to say, you are still mine. Because the shadow, for all its chaos, holds power. And the moment you bring it into the light, it stops being your enemy. It becomes your teacher. And that changes everything. Because now, when you pause before judging, when you notice your triggers and lean in instead of running, when you hear that voice inside that says, "I'm still hurt," and you finally choose to listen, you're no longer a prisoner of your past. You're no longer being pulled by invisible strings. You're no longer stuck in cycles that leave you wondering, why does this keep happening to me? You become the author, and that is where healing begins. Let's talk about how this journey leads us back to the very beginning, to the child who first learned what parts were safe to show, and what parts had to be hidden just to survive. Technique number 1. Be honest with yourself. If the shadow lives in what we've denied, then we have to ask, when did we first learn to deny? When did we first decide, this part of me is not safe here? The answer is almost always the same: childhood. Because that's where it begins, not with trauma that screams, but with patterns that whisper, subtle, quiet, like a change in the weather you didn't know was happening until you were soaked. So now, close your eyes, walk back, not with blame, but with awareness, to that kitchen table where your voice trailed off because no one was listening, to that classroom where you were punished for daydreaming too much, to that hallway where you learned to hold in your tears because crying made you weak, to that birthday where you smiled for the photo, even though the silence in the room felt louder than the laughter. This is not about memory. This is about contact. Because shadow work doesn't ask you to relive your past. It asks you to meet it, with eyes that no longer need to survive but are finally ready to see. Ask yourself, what parts of me were not welcome in that house? What emotions did I learn to lock away just to be accepted? What did I trade for safety? Maybe it was your voice, maybe your joy, maybe your need to be held. And so you adapted. You became the good one, the quiet one, the strong one, the one who didn't make trouble. But beneath the mask, the real you didn't disappear. You just went into hiding. And that's the thing about childhood, what we don't process. We repeat. What we forget, we become. Because the child who was never allowed to be angry often grows into an adult who can't express anger in a healthy way or avoids confrontation altogether. The child who only received love for achievements often becomes an adult addicted to performance-chasing perfection just to feel enough. And the child who was made to feel too loud, too messy, too much, often becomes someone who dims their own light just to stay liked. But here's what most people miss. This isn't about blaming our parents. It's not about finding a villain. It's about recognizing that the rules of love you were taught as a child may still be writing the script of your adult life. And until you see them, until you question them, they will continue to guide your choices from the shadows. This is why returning to your childhood isn't regression. It's reclamation. You're not going back to get stuck. You're going back to retrieve what was left behind. The voice that went quiet, the fire that went cold, the tears that never got to fall. And when you meet that younger version of yourself, not with shame, but with compassion, something shifts. You start to hear things you couldn't hear back then. You start to say things you always needed to say. You begin to understand, this wasn't my fault. I was just surviving the only way I knew how. And from that understanding comes healing. From that tenderness comes strength, because now you don't need to hide those parts anymore. You can invite them home. You can hold them. You can rewrite what love means, starting with how you love yourself. And once you do that, the cycle begins to break. No more chasing what was never meant for you. No more performing just to belong. No more mistaking silence for peace. You begin to live not as a reaction to your past, but as a creation of your truth. And it's from this place, from this sacred reunion with your inner child, that the next step unfolds, the one that requires something even more difficult than remembering honesty. Technique number 2, reflect on your reactions. Some wounds don't leave scars, they leave echoes. In the way we flinch when no one's hitting, in the way we chase approval from people who never asked us to, in the way we shrink in moments that call for our full height. And often, we don't even know why. We just call it being sensitive or overthinking. But the truth is simpler than that. We're not reacting to this moment. We're reliving that one, the one we never fully processed. That's why returning to your childhood isn't some sentimental exercise. It's not about blame or rewriting the past. It's about finally understanding what shaped you so it stops shaping you without your permission. Go back to the moment you stopped speaking up because being quiet got you love, to the time you buried your anger because it scared the people you needed, to the day you started smiling not because you were happy, but because it kept the peace. Ask yourself, who did I have to become to be loved? And what part of me did I have to bury to be safe? It's not easy, this kind of honesty, because it reveals something most of us don't want to admit, that the mask we wear today was once our only form of protection. But if you want to heal, if you want to stop repeating the same story with different faces, you've got to go back and meet the child who learned those rules. The one who equated love with performance. The one who mistook control for safety. The one who believed that silence was strength. Sit with them. Listen to what they were never allowed to say. Hold the tears that were never allowed to fall. You'll start to see that so many of your adult struggles, the relationships that leave you empty, the self-sabotage that shows up right before things go right, the chronic guilt that whispers even when you're doing nothing wrong, they aren't flaws. They're echoes, unfinished emotions, unspoken stories. And they've been waiting, not to be fixed, but to be heard. Because that's all the shadow ever needed: acknowledgement. Not judgment, not resistance, just truth. And when you finally give that child inside of you what they were once denied: validation, safety, permission to be, you don't just heal the past, you free your present. That's where the loop ends. That's where the pattern breaks. That's where you stop living your childhood on repeat and start writing something new. But to do that, you'll need something else. Something even more raw. The kind of honesty that looks in the mirror and says, I am both the wound and the one who can heal it. Technique number 3, reflect on your reactions. Sometimes, it only takes a word, or a look, or silence, and something inside you flinches, tightens, flares. You say, they disrespected me. They didn't care. They made me feel worthless. But what if they only touched what was already there? What if the pain wasn't created in that moment but remembered? This is what we miss about reactions. They're not just responses to what's happening. They're echoes of what hasn't healed. Shadow work asks us to slow down, to pause long enough to ask, why did this moment feel so familiar? Why did that comment cut so deep? Because that flare of anger, that rush of defensiveness, that sudden pull to disappear, they're not flaws. They're messengers. They point to places inside you where a wound still lives, where a younger version of you is still holding on to something you never got to process. A rejection, a betrayal, a silence that spoke louder than words. It's easy to say, they triggered me. But the question is, what did they activate? Your partner asks for space, and you hear abandonment. A friend cancels plans, and you feel unimportant. Your boss critiques your work, and suddenly you're back in that classroom, desperate to get it right, terrified to be seen as wrong. These aren't just emotional slips, they're doorways. And if you dare to walk through them, not to punish yourself, but to understand, you begin to reclaim power that was quietly slipping through your fingers. This is the real practice, not self-control, but self-inquiry. To say, I feel triggered, that's not a failure, that's a signal. To trace it back gently, what am I protecting? What am I afraid they'll see? What part of me is still aching for safety? In that space between the moment something hits you and the moment you react, there's a gap. And in that gap is everything. Your growth, your power, your freedom. It's what Viktor Frankl meant when he said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Because here's the truth. You can't stop being triggered, but you can stop being owned by it. You can learn to see the shadow without becoming it, to witness the storm inside without being swept away. And slowly, reaction turns into reflection. Impulse becomes insight. Pain becomes possibility. This is not about becoming calm or emotionless. It's about becoming conscious. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that got stuck in the past and bringing them into the present, where you can finally choose something different. And when you do, you don't just respond differently, you are different. And from that inner shift comes the soft, quiet power of someone who knows their own depths and no longer fears them. And that's where the real transformation begins. In the moment you stop reacting to protect your shadow and start listening to it instead. Technique 4. Acknowledge, understand, and forgive. This is the part no one teaches you. How to sit with the parts of yourself you swore you'd never face again. Not the mask, not the persona, but the trembling parts, the broken ones, the ones that whisper, am I still too much or worse? Am I not enough? Shadow work brings you here, not to fix you, not to make you perfect, but to bring you face to face with what you've run from the longest, your own pain. And this isn't abstract. It's visceral. It's the moment you look into the eyes of your past self, the one who snapped when all they wanted was to be heard, the one who clung too tight because they were terrified of being left, the one who hurt someone else because they didn't know how to ask for help. And instead of turning away, you kneel, you breathe, you say, I see you. and I won't abandon you again. That's where healing begins. Because forgiveness isn't some grand gesture. It's not about saying, "What happened was okay." It's saying, "I no longer need to punish myself for surviving it the only way I knew how." It's saying, "That wasn't weakness. That was a cry for help. And I don't have to carry the shame that never belonged to me." You start to realize the anger that scares you isn't evil. It's a boundary that was never allowed to form. The jealousy that eats at you isn't toxic. It's a part of you that felt unseen for too long. And the sadness, it's just love with nowhere to go. What if these parts weren't mistakes, but messengers? What if your shadow wasn't a flaw, but a fragment of you asking for light? That's what it means to sit with your pain, to stop trying to fix, avoid, or outrun, to listen without judgment, to feel without flinching. Ask yourself, can I stay with my anger long enough to hear what it's protecting? Can I hold my grief like a child too afraid to cry out loud? Can I forgive the version of me that didn't know better without needing to rewrite the past? Because here's the truth, most never hear. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't come in a breakthrough. It comes in silence, in stillness, in the sacred pause where you decide to stop running and start returning, not to who the world wanted you to be, but to who you've always been underneath the survival. This is not about becoming a better person. It's about becoming a whole one. It's not about light defeating darkness. It's about learning to sit with both and realizing they were never enemies to begin with. So yes, this part hurts. But it also liberates. Because when you stop judging the pain, when you stop demanding healing look a certain way, you begin to see it for what it truly is, an invitation, a homecoming. A chance to love the parts of you that once believed they had to disappear in order to be loved. And when that happens, you don't just change. You come back to life, quietly, gently, completely. We spend so much of our lives running from pain, from silence, from parts of ourselves we were never taught to hold. We run toward labels that make us feel safe, toward roles that win us love, toward a version of ourselves that looks good, but feels hollow. And somewhere in that race, we lose track of the boy who just wanted to be heard, the girl who needed to be angry, the soul who only wanted to be seen without conditions. Shadow work isn't some spiritual checklist. It's not a performance of healing. It's a quiet revolution, one that begins not with effort, but with remembrance. It's the soft voice that says, "You don't need to be perfect to be whole. You don't need to shine to be worthy of light. You don't need to keep hiding." Jung didn't give us answers. He handed us a mirror. And it's only when we dare to look into it, truly look, that we stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start whispering, "There you are. I remember you." This is the soul's return, not to what the world asked you to be, but to what you were before the world forgot how to love you. And that return, that's where freedom lives. So I'll ask you now, what part of your shadow is quietly waiting to come home? Leave it in the comments, not for validation, but to be witnessed. And if this reflection stirred something in you, send it to someone who's ready to stop performing and start healing. Follow echoes of thought for more of what the soul remembers, but the world forgot. I'll see you in the next breath of silence. in the next reflection, where healing isn't loud but holy.